Welcome back to this collaboration between Denver United Methodist and Huntersville United Methodist as we are partnering on this series called Lost and Found, and we are working our way through the 15th chapter of Luke's Gospel. As you can see, Pastor Paul Thompson is with me once again, and we are collaborating on Zoom once again. And just to the why of that is I have recently been around someone who had some symptoms that they felt like they needed to get tested, and their test is pending. And until that test comes back, I'm trying to do the right thing and, of course, and stay away from folks. So that's why Paul and I are not in the same room. And Paul,
and I might prefer it that way, but I'll go either direction.
All right. Well, and again, just an encouragement to everybody out there. We are all fighting through this response to COVID-19 together. And if err on the side of caution, if you feel the least, I know it may seem like paranoia, but you're better to be safe than sorry. And that's kind of the what I'm operating under. And that's why Paul and I are doing this on Zoom this week.
Yeah. And I appreciate your kindness in that, Steve, and just recognize that we can't be too careful at this point in terms of, if we know that possibility exists, we've been exposed, we can do the right thing. And I'm appreciative of you doing that with me today.
Well, it's also, we want to, again, do the right thing and take care of each other. And this Luke chapter 15 starts with a shepherd whose job is to take care of sheep, right?
Right.
And we've been working our way through. We've gone through the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and now we've got what some people call the parable of the lost son. Usually we don't call it that, however. We almost always refer to this as the parable of the prodigal son. And have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's fascinating that we refer to this in the negative. We talk about the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, rather than the found coin, the found sheep, the loving, the gracious father. That may say a little bit more about us than it says about the parables themselves, that we go negative rather than positive with it. But nonetheless, these are compelling stories, compelling parables.
And what is fascinating about it is, and by the way, if you hear any alerts coming in, it's because neither Paul nor myself know enough about our computers to cut off the alerts. We need help with that. But so we just ask you to please ignore that as those pop up here and there. And also give you an idea of just how many emails your pastors get. So that might be helpful. So all of these stories are just that, stories, right? Story has power, which is why I think Jesus so often teaches in the form of story. The narrative that we get from the overall scripture is a story of God's love. And sometimes we get really, we start, I think, majoring in the minor at times when we debate each other over scripture and how scripture works. But you can't deny that the overall story of scripture, and this story in particular, is very, very compelling.
Well, this story is very familiar to many of us. I laughed a few years ago, an invitation to go and preach at this church on Topsail Island. And the only caveat they had was just don't preach on that parable. We've heard that ad nauseum.
So what you're saying is every preacher who came in there preached that same
message, because we all love this story. This story resonates so deeply with us. As I think you referenced earlier, this really is the gospel in microcosm, and it's a fascinating story, and I'm excited about the chance to kind of walk with it through you.
Right, and I'm so
through it with you.
Yeah, I think. Thank you. I think the story, and I just want to take a moment to reflect on that, the power of story. When I remember as a kid asking about Adam and Eve and this and that, and also asked where the cavemen were in the Bible, which got me almost kicked out of my Sunday school class. And
where the dinosaurs,
where the dinosaurs were. Those were not the right questions to ask. And sometimes I think we don't ask we can ask the wrong question. Like we can ask, were Adam and Eve real people and all that kind of stuff without stopping to think, the power is in the story. I had a professor from who named David Steinmetz, who wrote an interesting article I read several years ago about the power of story. He writes about how all the debates around Genesis, we often have the wrong debate. The question isn't whether it's real or not in his mind. And I know some people, just now blood pressure went through the roof. The question is, what does the story say? And he asked this question about this parable, for instance. He said, what if there was never a real father? What if there wasn't a real son, younger brother, or older brother? Would it change the story? Does it change the power of the story if these weren't real people, if these weren't flesh and blood people? And the answer, of course, is no. We don't know if did this real, my guess is Jesus makes this story up to teach us something that's deeply true about God. And that's where the power of story comes from. And again, if you have any issues with that, just send all your emails to Pastor Paul. He'll be glad to answer them. But
one of the things that I've learned, especially having taught disciple Bible study so much, is what the Bible really is. What the Bible really is God's self-revelation. From beginning to end, the story is about God. One of the tools we use in disciple Bible study is any passage that we read, any passage from Genesis to Revelation, anywhere in between, is we ask the question, what does this passage tell us about God? Secondly, we ask, what does this passage tell us about human beings? And then third, we ask, what is the relationship in this passage between God and human beings? When we begin to look at Scripture this way, we can eliminate some of those questions that really aren't going to be very fruitful. And instead, we can understand Scripture for what it rightly is, a way that God is communicating God's self to us. And primarily, God does this, Jesus does this, especially beautifully through story. It's the story, in this particular case, of a sheep, a coin, and then a son that really gives us the nature of who God is.
And the story of this passage is epic. It connects across all religious traditions. It connects across all of humanity. And I'm sure you can find somebody somewhere who's never heard the story of the prodigal son, but they probably heard the term prodigal, and they may not even know why or where it has come from.
This parable is probably Jesus' most famous parable. And what a parable is simply we lay two things beside one another and we compare and contrast them. The story enables us to put two different things. In this particular case, it's the story of a son and a father. It's the story of God and us. We lay them beside one another and we begin to compare and contrast, and we begin to see what is the nature of this God who, as we get into the story, we're going to figure out if this really tells us about God, boy, this story really is good news.
Right. And it's also fascinating how Jesus uses this in the context of the larger stories he's already told. One of the things that's fascinating to me is you start with 1 out of 100. So one sheep out of 100. Then you move to one coin out of 10. And now you're moving to one son out of 2. The stakes get higher.
It's increasingly personal.
Right. You're not talking about 1% of your property and a sheep that you may care about or not. Right. You're not talking about a coin, which is valuable, right? Is this lady? I did a little math, by the way, and that comes up to about $2,000 an hour. If you make $50,000 a year, one coin that Jesus was talking about would have been about $2,000. Nothing for someone like you, but a lot for somebody like me.
Yeah.
And now you're not talking about coins or sheep. You're not talking about 10% or 1%. You're talking about half your family, and you're talking about people. So it gets, as you said, it gets personal really quickly. The stakes are higher in this story.
Well, Fred Craddock uses a brilliant analogy for me when he talks about how the backdrop of the story is this dark background around which I resonate. Man, I can relate to the darkness. But then the good news of this diamond that's laid against that dark background, and truly the brilliance of the the diamond is revealed. The brilliance of the beauty of God's love is revealed when we put it against this story. And that's why I think it's so important for us and why it resonates so deeply within us. And how good it is, Steve, that we get to do this. So we're drawing out of time for today's video podcast. I am always grateful for the opportunity that we have to share with one another and to share with you. And thank you for your time today. Come back tomorrow and we're going to get into the first part of the story as we begin to talk about this rebellious son. So that'll be good fodder for conversation tomorrow.
Absolutely. And as we prepare for tomorrow, what does the word rebellion mean? Take some time to think that through, and also ask yourself, where have I seen other acts of rebellion in the Bible? And we'll look at those over our next 2 podcasts. So thank you, Paul, for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thanks. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.